Hello and welcome to the Learning and Development Podcast, sponsored by Infopro Learning. As always, I'm your host, Nolan Hout. Joining me today, we have Matt Gjertsen, CEO and founder of Better Everyday Solutions. Matt has an incredible journey, including 9 years as an instructor pilot, but not to worry, this is not a fighter pilot podcast, so we won't be getting too deep into that. What we are going to be talking about today is an incredibly popular topic that Matt has literally packed the halls. We're talking standing room only, talking about hacking the brain for behavior change. Now, I understand that sounds a little lofty, but we're going to make light work of it, I promise. So let's go ahead and let's get started. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Nolan. I'm really excited to be here. I always love talking about this topic, especially since, at the last ATD conference, we had to turn people away from the room. So I'm always trying to get this out to more people.
Yeah, well, what a great way to do that. Before we get into that topic, though, just want to start off with tell us about your journey to where you are today. You know, I talked a little bit about the fighter pilot stuff, but tell us how you got to, because you have such an interesting background getting you into corporate training and then what you're doing today.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people say that they fell into learning and development, and I actually like to say I failed into learning and development in some ways. So, I was an instructor pilot in the U.S. Air Force. The reason why I was an instructor pilot was because in pilot training, I was near the top of my class through most of training, and they always pick one person to stay behind and make an instructor pilot at pilot training immediately after they graduate. So most people, you go through pilot training for a year, and then you go fly your major weapon system, and then maybe 3-4 years later you come back to be an instructor. But for one person in every class, they pick to stay behind. It can't be the first ranked person. The first ranked person has to get their first choice. And so it usually winds up being the second ranked person. And that was me. So I failed one of my check rides and did, and some other stuff. And so it dropped me down to second. And so then I stayed on as an instructor pilot. And so that's why I spent so much time as an instructor. I went to a 4-month course on how to teach flying planes, not just how to fly planes. So that's where it kind of started, in terms of formal training. And then when I went to leave active duty, I have always been obsessed with space. And so I wanted to join the number one game in town when it comes to space, and that's SpaceX for sure. So I networked my way in there. No idea that corporate learning and development is a thing that exists, but they said they needed help with training. And I said, yeah, I've done training. I've trained people how to fly planes. How hard can it be? And so then I kind of fell in love with the whole industry, and the rest is history. I led the training development team at SpaceX for 4 years.
Wow.
Went to another startup and helped build their team there, and then started Better Everyday Studios about a little over 3 years ago now.
And what does Better Everyday Studios focus on?
So we focus on leadership development, specifically new leaders. The tagline that I always like to use is, we turn great engineers into great managers.
Oh, that's good.
Because I've spent so much of my career around these really smart technical minds, and because they're so smart and because they're so good as individual contributors, they get promoted to be a manager, and then they fall on their face and they don't enjoy their job, and their team members don't enjoy being there anymore. And so it has all these implications. And so fixing that specific challenge of helping these really smart people who are great technically, but might just be missing some of the people skills, that's where we come in with, programs, facilitated programs, customized programs for organizations.
Yeah, I always tell people kind of my favorite, use case of the, promoting the best person to be a manager doesn't always work out. We created this program for UPS like years ago, a decade ago, I guess at this point. And it was because they promoted their best drivers, route drivers, to managers. Mm-hmm. And just like coding, your ability to code or program or develop a rocket has nothing to do with leadership skills. Well, maybe tangentially, but like one doesn't beget the next. So these types of programs are so important. Because usually those high performers traditionally show signs of good leadership, but then they do need that whole other end of training. So wonderful. A question I have is how many Top Gun references are in your training programs?
So I actually, it's funny. There's not a lot. I usually use, most of my stories are either from the Air Force or from my time at SpaceX for sure. I lean a lot into the space stuff these days. But yeah, you can never have too many Top Gun references. It's great.
I'm watching it. My It's probably too. I watched Top Gun every single day when I was 6 years old, like
Oh wow.
every day. And so
Yeah.
my wife's like, can our kids watch it? I'm like, it's rated PG. Of course our kids can watch it. For the most part, that's okay.
There's a
But yeah,
you just fast forward a couple
there's a
scenes and
couple scenes in terrible language, but
yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so wonderful. Well, Matt, thank you again for kind of lending us your talents today to talk about this wonderful subject of hacking the brain for behavior change. And as I mentioned earlier, quite a lofty kind of title. Let's just start with like, what is it that we're talking about here? What is the premise of this?
Yeah, yeah. And so I think we can break it into two parts of the hacking the brain and then the behavior change piece, because I think,
Yeah.
what we're talking about here is, one, behavior change. I think that's a really important concept that I think more and more of the learning and development industry is becoming what I would almost call like behaviorist,
Mm,
if you want to use that
yeah.
as a term, because I think the challenge is that when people think of training, usually they default to our common denominator, which is school. And so we think about
Right. Yeah,
education,
sure. Sure.
knowledge transfer. And so a big part of what I really believe is important is knowledge is great and it has its place, but really what we want to talk about is behavior change. In the
Hmm.
corporate world, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to either encourage behaviors that we like or change behaviors that we don't like. That's
Hmm.
that's what we can see, that's what we can measure, and so that's what we need to focus on. And I didn't when I moved into the corporate development world, I didn't realize how much of a different idea this was, because I'd spent all my life growing up in the military, and so military training is extremely behavior based. That's what it is. When
Yeah.
you're in the cockpit with somebody, it's can they do the thing or not? Are they able to land? Are they able to take off? Are they able to handle a stall appropriately? Like it's all behavior based, and so I think that's the first piece of it. It's just
And what's the
yeah.
difference, sorry, between, or maybe it's the same, is behavior and skill synonymous in this case? Because like everything right now is right, is, oh, let's make a skills-based organization. Now,
Yeah,
in my mind, I
yeah.
view them differently, but then you mentioned, can this pilot land the plane? And I'm thinking, well, gosh, I don't know where that would fit.
Yeah, I'll freely admit that though I believe definitions are very important, I am very flexible
Yeah,
in my
no, that's fine. Yeah, yeah,
definitions,
no,
and I
that's
and
good.
I because you bring up a really great point of, are we talking about behaviors? Are we talking about skills? Are we talking about capabilities? Like, are we talking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
competencies?
yeah.
And I'm not necessarily because I think skills and behaviors can be the same thing, or they can be different depending on an individual organization and
Mm,
how you want to define them. The most important thing is that within a specific organization or program, you do define all of these
right.
things, and you define them in a way that is practical and useful. I think one of the reasons why I often say behaviors instead of skills is because skills tends to bring up these like 35,000 long skill
Taxonomies.
matrices,
Yeah,
Yeah. And that's just not useful.
yeah, yeah.
It's just not super practical. And so rather than, and because often you're trying to come up with a key phrase
Yeah,
to call that skill of its Excel usage
yeah.
or whatever it
Whatever it
is.
would be.
And so when I say behavior, I think behavior, it might not be as catchy of a phrase. It might be because really what we're talking about is here, what's the thing you're going to see in the workplace? The
Mm.
thing that you're going to see somebody doing. And that's what you want to identify.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. So,
Yeah.
so that's the behavior side of it. You said. Now let's look at the
Yeah.
other half of that equation.
Yeah, and so the hacking the brain thing really came out of when I started at SpaceX. I was filled with imposter syndrome,
Mm.
right? Here I am. I have no formal learning and development background, but I'm leading the learning and development team in one of the most innovative companies in the world, surrounded by all these really smart people. And so, in an effort to kind of raise my game, I just started diving into books. Started with more big picture, like personal development stuff, like Tony Robbins or Tim
Yeah.
Ferriss and that kind of thing. That spiraled into some of the books around high performance. So,
Mm.
like a particular one is Peak by Anders Ericsson, which is all about like the new science of peak performance
Okay.
and what it takes to achieve these highest echelon things. and behaviors. And then that then led me into a little bit of neuroscience, a little bit of, like behavior science, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, where it's really figuring out where all these behaviors come from. Why do we behave? So if we want to focus on changing behavior, then we need to figure out, why do people behave a certain way? And if you read Thinking Fast and Slow, How Emotions Are Made by Amy Feldman Barrett, these kinds of books give you some of the background into the psychology and into the biology of just what's happening in your brain. That, stimulus comes in, your brain does some stuff, and behavior results. And so it's understanding some of that stuff at like a basic level that you need to then kind of apply to how to change behavior and do good instructional design in order to change behavior.
Yeah, and I mean, so one of my favorite stories from Thinking Fast and Slow was the firefighter who walks into the building and knows it's going to collapse. But
Yes.
so he yells, "Hey, everybody out!" Everybody gets out.
Yes.
They interview him, and he's like, "Yeah, God told me the building was going to collapse." And they're like, "Okay,
Yeah.
that's great, but maybe there's a little bit more science behind it." And what they realize is that there's too many factors for him to even understand how he made that decision, right? More than likely it was
Yes.
the smell of the fire, the heat of the sound, the crackling, the visions. He just instinctually knew that in his brain, formed by all of the behaviors that he's done. So you're right, those two things absolutely sync together.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that was kind of an aha moment for me as I started reading about this stuff, is just how much of what you perceive as reality is hallucinated. It's made up.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not, 90% of what you are actually seeing, what you're perceiving as what you're seeing in the world, only 10% of it is based on the actual photons that are hitting your eye.
Yeah.
Because there's
Wow.
just so much data that's streaming into your eyes that your brain just doesn't have the power. It's not efficient for it to
Yeah.
process all of it. It only processes enough of it to then extrapolate an accurate picture of the world.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
and the key thing that the example that I always use from my life is, I very clearly remember one time when I was driving to work. This was many years ago, and like a lot of people, you kind of go into
Yeah.
autopilot when you're driving to work. You're listening to music, you're doing your thing, and I'm sitting at a light waiting to turn left. I'm listening to music, I'm rocking out, I'm doing my thing. Turn light turns green. I start to drive. I get halfway around the corner, and all of a sudden, this high schooler materializes in the crosswalk. He just appears in the middle of the crosswalk. And, I'm still going slow, so I see him, I
Yeah.
stop, it's fine, we go. But like, literally, because to my conscious
Yeah.
brain,
Yeah.
he did just materialize.
Uh-huh.
That light coming in that represented him wasn't being processed into my brain. And so basically, your brain is always just like looking for a difference between reality and what it's, predicting. And only when that difference gets wide enough does it like boom and like snap you into focus and bring you back. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into it then. Like, so how do we go about hacking the brain for behavior change?
Yeah, so the way, and again, this is not. There's plenty of people who are way smarter than I am on the neuroscience of this. So go follow other people. I think of this just as this is my instructional design methodology, if you will, to remind me of the things to do. And so there's 3 key steps. There's specificity, context, and connection. So we can start with the specificity piece. And specificity really goes back to the behavior that we're talking about. The way I get specific is I always ask a subject matter expert, what behavior are you trying to change? And honestly, the more specific you can get, the better. And to give you a really concrete example from my flying days, one of my last flights as an instructor pilot, I was flying with a woman who she had learned to fly the KC-10. She'd flown the KC-10 for a couple of years. And then she had left the KC-10 and gone and flown something else for about a year. And now she was coming back. And so she was on kind of her refresher flights. We went up, we flew around, we did some air refueling and stuff. We came back. And then when we come back, we go to land and she can't land. She has forgotten how to land the KC-10. And what would happen is, as we're coming down final, she would just be kind of, she's too high, she's too low, she's too fast, she's too slow. She was just kind of all over the place. And so we were planning on practicing landing. And the way you practice landing in a plane is in something called the pattern, where basically you touch down. Immediately after you touch down, you put the throttles back up, you take off again, and then you do a 180, and you basically just enter into this circle. You do this loop, and so every loop, which takes a couple of minutes, you get a chance to practice how to land the plane. And as I'm watching her, there was one key moment where everything was going wrong, and it's called the perch. And the perch happens whereas you're flying the plane, you're going straight and level, the runway is going back this way from you, and you look down, and when you're about parallel to the end of the runway where you're going to be landing, what you do is you perch, you pull the throttle back, you lower the nose, and you turn. You're going to start one continuous turn to get lined up with the runway to land. And she was doing that incorrectly. And so when I say specificity and how specific you can be, the behavior that I needed to figure out how to change for her, you might say, well, she couldn't land.
Right.
It's like, okay, like that's something I can see, but it's still, there's a lot of things that go into landing a plane. And so after watching her second attempt to land, I was able to realize all that it was is she was pulling the throttle back 1 inch instead of 2 inches. That's it. That 1 inch difference in throttle movement was the thing that I now need to figure out how to change. And so once I identify that, I can now do my instructional design of like, okay, what's the learning intervention here that's going to change that specific behavior? And so that can apply to, you can do this same thing with any skill in the workplace. And so what we do in our workshops is we have people do this in real time of saying, okay, like what's the outcome that you're not achieving? What's the behavior that you're trying to change? Oftentimes it ends up being many behaviors that you're trying to change, but you have to isolate them and attack them one at a time.
Yeah. It's like Honda, famously had like the 5 whys. You ask why 5 times. Like, oh, they couldn't, the person failed. Well, why? Because they couldn't land the plane. Well, why? Because they couldn't hit the runway at the right angle. Well, why? Oh, well, they didn't do the perch throttle maneuver. Oh, okay. Like now we got it. Now let's move forward with it. And same exact thing happens in corporate world. Of course it does, right? Like, why isn't the person selling? The person isn't selling. Well, why? Because they can't close deals. Well, why can't they close deals? Oh, well, when it comes to pricing, they just don't really seem how to negotiate. Okay, so negotiation then is the problem. Absolutely agree. And if you don't know what that issue is, you don't, and we see this all the time when we're talking about building personalized learning journeys. This is what we're trying to get, around is let us not have everybody go through 10 hours of a program if they can test out of 8 of them. Because what they're going to do is then they're going to, sorry, but half-ass the first 8 hours and actually the first 10 hours and the 2 hours that they actually really could have used that help.
They're going to skim over.
They're going to skim it. They're going to ignore it. They're going to do whatever. So you've lost you've actually disengaged them. Yeah,
that's 100% right. It's funny, you bring up sales because the last company I worked in, we built a sales boot camp for them.
Oh, cool.
And that was 100. The first behavior was these new. It was a relatively complex product, and so these new SDRs, these sales development representatives, they just weren't sounding confident enough. They were hemming and hawing, and so they just didn't. They couldn't confidently and quickly explain the product. That's like, boom, like, okay, like that's it. Now we can create a program to handle that. I don't know how to just like make somebody a better SDR. That's way too big. But knowing nothing about sales, I can figure out how to make somebody more confident when they explain the product.
Yeah, totally. So that's specificity. I think the next one you said context.
The next one is context. Yeah. And so what context means, and this could be a couple of different things, but this is really where I think understanding how the brain reaches conclusions matters, because you remember things and make decisions in a certain context. These environmental cues are telling you, are going to dictate whether or not you remember something, and they're going to dictate kind of um, how you process that information, the conclusions that you draw from it. Again, Lisa Feldman Barrett is a great author on this in how emotions are made. In her book, she shows these great examples of how important context is. And so it's kind of really this behavior. Now that you've identified the behavior, the next step is to figure out what's the context in which this behavior is occurring. So in the example of the plane, flying is really exciting because you are in the context, right? The training is happening in the context. But the key thing here that I think helped with an unlock for her is the context of why she was getting it wrong as well. So in her case, I mentioned she had gone from a different plane and was coming back to the KC-10. The plane that she had been flying was a much smaller plane, and it was a propeller-driven plane. And so the thing about everything, mass has momentum, and so really big planes have a lot of momentum. So you pull the throttle back, and they just want to keep going. Whereas small planes, you pull the throttle back, and they stop. They just stop really quickly. And so the reason why she was pulling the throttle back 1 inch instead of 2 inches is because she was remembering the old plane, the old context.
Right.
And so by taking a minute to remind her of the new context that she was in, it kind of helped her brain like, oh, this is why I need to make this change. Because, really, I think what we're often doing, you mentioned thinking fast and slow, so it's like the system 1 or the system 2 thinking. Really what we're trying to do with training is help the system 2 know when to intervene,
Right.
First and foremost, and then hopefully after that change the system 1, right?
Yeah.
So it's like first get the front of the brain more involved in these new things, but then eventually get to the point where the front of the brain doesn't have to get involved. It's automatic again. But so context can in this case was, hey, we need to remind her of this so that her brain knows it needs to engage in this new behavior and it knows why to engage. But then I think also context can be making sure you're in the right context. And so then to go to the sales example again, because these SDRs were delivering this over the phone. This was during COVID, so everything was done over the phone. One of the things that we did is we actually set up like a Google Voice number for them to call and practice giving their pitch on the phone. Because, writing it down versus speaking it to another person versus saying it on the phone are all slightly different. And so if we really want to engage the context piece to make this as realistic as possible, then we need to have them practice actually holding their phone.
Yeah. There's something to the setting of it all. It's like kind of similar. Starbucks, this is a long time ago, they had in their onboarding, you had to write down what would happen if somebody came in and was just, irate. Just like absolutely irate about, I wanted coconut milk or whatever it was. And they said that and then they had to practice it. And they said that and they let them kind of choose what was the craziest situation and how they would respond. They're like, by actually writing it out, it kind of freed them from this idea of what is the worst thing that could happen. You know what I mean? You kind of think in the abstract, like in sales, you're like, oh, I know what I'm going to say. I know. But the second the person's like, you get a phone call, hey, this is Matt, I can't, how's your day going, Matt? And you're like, okay, what the heck is this? And if I said, all right, Matt, what do you want? Oh, shoot, now my brain's wired differently. I don't remember my training, so totally putting them in the context, and reframing it back as I can definitely see how it helps retrain, hack the brain to changing how that you're going to behave. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, the key thing that you mentioned there is, you're slowly raising the stakes with that Starbucks example. So initially in learning, you kind of want the lowest stakes possible. You want as little stress as possible. And so you start that journey by, let's just have them write it down. And that, by the way, that's exactly what we did in the training.
Yeah.
Where we started with, I think actually the process is okay, like describe our product in 500 words, write it down. Okay, now describe our product in 250 words. Okay,
Oh,
now describe our product in 100 words. So they have to keep distilling it down
yeah.
and they're doing it in their own language, but low stress because they're writing it. Okay, now speak that to me. Okay, now say it over the phone. So I think, yeah, it's how you start. There's lots of variables to this, but ultimately you need to get to okay, we're actually going to practice this in the relative context that we're in if you want any hope of people remembering it.
I'm supposed to lead a product training in a couple of weeks. I'm going to steal that 1,500, thing.
Yeah.
That's really
I think I actually stole it. I think I stole that from Adam Grant. I think he
okay.
said
So
he used to do that in one of his courses. I think it was him where, yeah, because like succinct, clear writing is just such an important skill. And that's always what they would do, except he took it to the extreme of, okay, now you have one word,
yeah,
right? Like if you have
yeah,
one word to describe this product, what's the word? Anyway.
yeah, really good. So we got the specificity, the context, and that last comes the connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And connection is just the realization that, okay, like what at the most basic level, what is learning? No, really, it is changing neural connections in the brain,
Mm,
right? You're
mm.
changing synapses. That is what you were doing when you were learning. And so as you're thinking about learning, you have to make sure you're building your intervention in a way that gives opportunities for those connections to be changed. Everything that we are just saying about like the sales, right? Like the
Yeah,
writing it down. Those are all examples. When I was in the plane, what we did is we kind of broke it up. So we identified, okay, hey, you're moving the throttle incorrectly. That's the problem. That's the mistake that you have. We understand the context of why. So now we need to try to retrain your brain, retrain these neural connections. So what we're going to do is the next pattern, I'm going to take it. I'm going to fly the plane,
okay.
and I just want you to follow my hand movements. So you're also going to have your hand on the throttle. You're going to have your hand on the yoke, but I'm going to be doing the flying. And so that allows her to remember again, okay, oh, this is how it feels.
Okay.
So that's repetition one. And then, okay, this next pattern, we are not going to try to land the plane. This next pattern, we know we're not going to land. We're going to do a go around, but you're going to fly it knowing that. And so, just like we said before, that's kind of like lowering the stress level
Yeah,
a little bit.
yeah.
We take away the stress of, oh, I need to get in the right spot. We're going to make this easy. We're going to do a go around, but just so you can just focus on this. I think on that one also, when we were flying downwind, which is normally just kind of straight and level, I had her just kind of move the throttle back and forth the right
Right.
amount just to get that
Okay. Yeah.
that muscle memory going, right?
Yeah.
And then finally the next time, then I had her land, and she successfully was able to land the plane. So it's thinking, and so that could be. It could be spaced repetition. It could be, how are we going to, what are we going to have people do writing exercises and then watch other people do it? Are we going to have quizzing? But it's thinking through, just remembering what are the methods that I'm going to be using to change those connections in the brain. There's lots of them that you can use,
Right.
but I have to make sure I'm thinking about that so that this doesn't become the typical like sage on the stage, one and
Yeah.
done. I'm just going to spit some information at you and assume that you know it now
Yeah.
because they don't.
Yeah. It's like, gosh, I feel like we're just like a library over here, but like 10,000 hours, right? Like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
just gotta do it and do it. And like, yes, okay, even the best training in the world, right? Okay, it's very specific. I've planted them in the right context. But if
hmm
that's, if you teach somebody to land a plane once, they're not a pilot. Like you got to
yeah,
teach, I don't know how many hours you have to have your pilot's license these days, but like it's a lot. And so
yeah.
they do that for a reason. So really, yes, thinking of it more from if I'm really trying to make a behavior change, it's going to have to be more than just this, because this is not going to change that. Yeah, maybe for 2 months they're going to, be more confident when they sell. But, 3 months later, when they start getting in, chaos and stress, and
Yeah.
then maybe between now and then they had a different training program. and they're now trying to remember that. Well, they've forgotten this old habit. So totally agree. So where does and maybe it's weaved within there, at what step do you, and maybe this comes even before then or at the end, where does it come into, if at all, like the connection to what is it, like the Maslow's like hierarchy of needs, like with the what's in it for me, right? Like at what point do you really like, connect the, okay, pilot, and if you don't do this, we will die. Like,
Yeah.
I kind of
Yeah.
assumed that was connection, was like connecting a
Yeah.
failure to
Mm.
your life, but understandably it's not. Where does that tie into, or if at all, into this particular thing?
Yeah, I think that really fits into the context piece
Okay.
for me.
Oh, true.
Like
Yeah.
that's
True.
what that's
True.
where I would put that
Yeah.
in, of like the kind of the bigger picture
Bigger.
of
Yeah.
where this
Makes
fits
sense.
in.
Yeah.
But you bring up a good point in that you have to think about it the whole time, of like, making sure that this is and I think that's one of the reasons why I like behaviors, is because you can really make sure, like, is this a relevant behavior?
Yeah.
Because very often there's a lot of, safety training or regulatory training is notorious for just teaching things that nobody's going to need to do,
Yeah.
actually. Very often when you have this hour-long course with all of these different things, when the behavior that is actually relevant to anybody is, when something goes wrong, call this phone number.
True.
That's
You know,
that's really all you want people to do.
What's so funny? You say that. We worked with a company who spent a lot of money on a compliance course. And
Yeah.
I was like, man, like, and I looked through it. It was like the content was very basic because it had to be, but the
Hmm.
program was very elaborate, like lots of video. And I asked the lady, the CLO, I was like, I interviewed her. I was like, what? No offense, but like most people just take this training and get, like, they pay the littlest they possibly can. And she said, for us, safety is our culture. So it
Hmm.
actually did create the content. Like in this case, like you said,
Hmm.
why
Hmm.
spend an hour on something if all you're trying to do is check the box? I think what she did is she said, I'm going to use this entire hour to explain how important safety is to our
Yep.
company. The afterthought is its compliance,
Interesting.
so yeah, like
Interesting. Yeah.
it was one of the most fascinating kind of conversations I had, because I realized that for her, the actual it was like Inception, the movie Inception, right? Like, I'm telling you, you're taking compliance training, but what I'm hoping you get out of it is that we care
Yeah.
about our people, and that's our culture.
I like it. I like it. Yeah, that's fantastic. I love it. Yeah, and
So
it really shows the importance of context to figure out the direction that you're
right,
going.
right, yeah. So then like let's look at roadblocks. So where in this journey, the specificity, the context, the connection, which is the hardest, you think, to kind of get right, and what are some common stumbling blocks people have when they're trying to create these programs to hack the brain?
I think
Yeah,
specificity is the
yeah,
hardest. I think, especially when you're dealing with subject matter experts.
yep.
Um, they went to school for a very long time. They have a lot of information in their brain, and it's so critical that you know how much they know. you know, and they're great people. Don't get me wrong. Like, and I've worked
Yeah,
with many great subject matter experts, and I obviously agree it is really good to know everything that they know.
yeah,
But I think that's why I love the question of what behavior you're trying to change. Very often I'll sit down with a subject matter expert and they spend 20 minutes walking through a whole whiteboard of, we want to talk about this and this and this and this. And it's all the stuff they want people to know.
yeah.
And, but then if you reframe the question of, well, what do you want them to do? Actually, I'll bring this up because I do think a lot of times when people talk about learning, they talk about what's the ROI, like what's the business impact you're trying to achieve. And I 100% agree that that is important. But in my experience, your average subject matter expert, the average POC that you're going to be working with to create a course, it's all that's too big a term. That's not within their wheelhouse, right? Like, and so by the behavior piece, it helps narrow it down. And so I think there can be pushback sometimes on streamlining just that much. Like, if we really identify, no, we just want people to call a phone number, we can't have a course that just says call this phone number, right? We need all this other
Yeah.
stuff. So I think that's probably one of the most common roadblocks that happen. And then related, but a little bit bigger picture, is kind of with all of this is if you identify the behavior that you're trying to change, realize the context, realize the amount of work that it takes to really
Mm.
secure this connection,
Yeah.
is we're doing too much for the time and resources we have allowed. You know,
Yeah.
and that's one of the most important conversations I have with people right now when the first thing they ask me is like, well, how long's your program? And I say, well, what are you trying to do? We can make the
Yeah.
program as long or as short as you want it, as long as it matches with the change you're trying to achieve,
Yeah.
right? So if you're trying to do something big and grand and transform the way people lead their teams, well, then it's going to take a big and grand amount of time and resources because it's just the way it works. And I would but in reality, if you want people to get better at one-on-ones, then we should spend a quarter doing nothing but talking about one-on-ones, right? We should have 3 or 4 workshops. We should send half a dozen emails,
Yeah.
but it should all just be about
One on
one-on-ones
one.
for
Yeah.
3 months.
Yeah, really smart guy. He used to run a learning conference in Seattle with Amazon. His name's Darren. I was chatting with him about some skill development, and he was saying, for me, I don't think people can learn more than like 3 skills a year. Like he's like, just think of it, like.
Yeah. Hmm.
We're doing all these skills mapping. You mentioned, the 15 million skills taxonomies that we build. And he's like, really, how much can a human literally change in a short amount of time? And we
Yeah.
kind of have to be realistic with ourselves. Like it has nothing to do with their undesirable, like they want to change, they want to, but they've got so many factors working against them. But again, even if you didn't have enough time to train, even if you did whatever, still getting people to change a behavior it takes a long time to do.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's like, if you're like digging a hole for a post, right? If you don't dig it far enough, it's gonna
Deep
fall. Like
enough.
there is an amount
Yeah.
where just digging a hole doesn't mean you dug the hole. Like it's gonna stand, but it's
Yeah.
gonna stand for the night. And then
Yeah.
tomorrow morning when a squirrel hops on it, it's gonna fall. So like
Yeah.
you have to dig below the frost line. You have to for it to get deep enough to stand. And a lot of companies don't have the resources to dig the post deep enough or whatever. So
Yeah.
yeah, in my
Yeah.
mind, I was thinking definitely the connection would be hard just from
Yeah.
can we really have the sustainability of this program?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the top reason why so many learning programs seem like they don't have any impact is because it's not reaching a critical mass to
Yeah.
create the impact that you're trying to have. And the bigger the impact, the bigger that critical mass. And so that's why that specificity piece can really help, is because if you can really narrow it down of this is the thing we're trying to achieve, then you can approach it in a realistic way.
Yeah, totally. So I'm not going to try to sum it up. Normally I would, but I'm definitely not smart enough to do that. So Matt, sum this up for us again. We're hacking the brain for behavior change. Give us the 10,000. Give us the, Adam Grant. The how many words should I give you here? Let's see, like do 100 words.
Yeah,
Like give me
exactly.
the 100-word version.
Yeah, I think, so big picture in the corporate world, the thing we care about is behavior. And the way behavior happens is through the brain. So we need to understand how the brain processes information and then leads you to a conclusion that results in a behavior. And so if we want to adjust that system, then we need to first get incredibly specific about the behavior we are trying to change. We then need to ask the question, what is the context in which this behavior occurs? So we know what else what kind of information we need to include in that training. And then we need to figure out what are the activities that I'm going to include in the training to change the connections in the brain that will reinforce that behavior. That's kind of the broad sweep of the arc of what I'm asking myself every time I'm designing learning with this philosophy.
Well, wonderful. I don't know how many words that was, but that was incredibly concise. Wonderful. Well, thanks, Matt, so much for joining us. Really appreciate. I can understand why we pack the halls at ATD, and hopefully for those that were prevented from getting in, they can listen to this and get a bit of a version of that. So thank you so much for joining us, Matt. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Nolan. This has been fantastic. I always love talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to come back later too.
Yeah, I'll hold you to that. Thanks, Matt. See you later.